Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to be back in the committee in person, as well as Ranking Member Latta. I appreciate you having today's hearing and bringing up the piece of legislation that I drafted along with Congresswoman Eshoo, and I know she's here as well. I want to thank Congresswoman Eshoo for partnering with me on this important piece of legislation. Our bill, H.R. 3919, which is the Securing Equipment Act, stops the threat of China from infiltrating our networks by prohibiting the FCC from issuing equipment licenses to Chinese companies that are identified as national security threat. Not all companies, but companies that have made that distinction that the FCC is now identified as national security threats. In 2019, our committee worked in a bipartisan manner to help address the threat of China by passing the Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act of 2019. That landmark act instructed the FCC to do a few things. Among those, publish a list of telecommunication equipment deemed to be a national security threat, prohibit the use of federal funds for purchasing equipment made by those companies, authorize funding for U.S. carriers to rip and replace equipment that was made by those companies. So earlier this year, the FCC did what they were instructed to do, and in fact, published this list. This is the first list that's come out. It lists 5 different companies that are on this national security threat list. Every company on this list has ties to the Chinese Communist Party, with the Chinese government having ownership in many of them. Clearly, you can see why that was a concern that the FCC identified. We also know all too well that the CCP wastes no opportunity to expose our vulnerabilities and to undermine our national security. While the 2019 law took a major step in getting compromised tech out of U.S. networks, U.S. carriers can still provide privately purchased equipment from these listed companies on the open market. So these companies can still sell to American companies where that data can be controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. Since all of those companies are subject to Chinese national security laws, at any point the Chinese government can choose to exploit them for espionage, tapping into their access in U.S. networks to gain critical information on individuals and sensitive government information. As we expand our 5G networks and heavy data flows and the critical technologies that rely on these networks, such as driverless cars and the Internet of Things, any existence of compromised technology poses a grave threat to our national security. Our bill seeks to further improve on the 2019 law. By prohibiting the FCC from issuing any equipment license to these companies, our bill adds an extra layer of security and puts a full stop to Chinese equipment from these threatening companies that are threats to our network. I look forward to having a full markup on this bill and moving it to the floor so we can better protect our networks. And I also want to ask, Mr. Chairman, I'll start with you, Mr. Johnson. As we look at the 2019 law that among other things, directed the FCC to create this list, which they now have done. These companies have had to do some things that are very, very alarming to be included on this national security threat list. When you look at this proposed legislation by myself and Congressman Eshoo, do you think this gives an extra layer of protection to the FCC? As we know, lawsuits are going to come, as lawsuits have come by companies from other protective measures that our committee has passed, so that the FCC has the ability to back up their actions, to back up this list, by then following through and saying you're not going to be able to sell. Companies that are threats are not going to be able to sell in the United States these jeopardized products.
Thank you, Congressman. I really appreciate that question, and I think it has been noted the cognitive dissonance of the ban on Huawei and ZTE for subsidized USF networks, but the legal availability of Huawei and ZTE everywhere else in the U.S. market has been noted.
And we see Huawei and ZTE challenging some of those laws as well.
And I note the Fifth Circuit upheld the dismissal of Huawei's suit, I think last week. So probably on pretty sound legal ground as of now. Certainly a statute backing up the FCC's authority would bolster that authority. And especially for something that is this is a very profound power that the FCC would have through this. I love all my friends in the equipment authorization world. but it's a somewhat obscure radio frequency interference-based administrative law process. And so the power for the FCC to be able to block major companies altogether from the market is profound, and I think that underscores the importance of having fulsome processes from elsewhere in the government that feed into those designations, as has happened with the 5 companies that are mentioned first in the NDAA.
Thanks.
statute.
And I know
Gentleman's
we're out
time
of
has
time, so
expired.
hopefully by passing the Securing Equipment Act, we can address this problem and others. And again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing us to come up. Yield back.